Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. I find myself in very good spirits indeed, because I have had the great honor and privilege and opportunity to have been able to revisit the great work that is embodied in this box set right here. And that is, of course, the work of art that is Twin Peaks. This is a work of art. This is a cultural phenomenon. This is a delightful series that is a blend and mix of many tones and styles and genres and characters and approaches and aesthetic balances that all come together in a brilliant fashion. And as a result of that, and indeed for this and many other reasons, it has gained a very big following, and very deserving so, deserving of that following, of many fans and admirers across the globe for ever since it's been initially broadcast. And so this is the great series that is Twin Peaks. Now, for those who may know as well, over the course of, say, the last few weeks, I have had the great honor to have been able to talk about, in video discussions here on YouTube, just one-on-one, you and I have been able to talk to you, my dear friends, about each of the episodes in season 1, and then each of the episodes in season 2, and including also the pilot, or a certain version of the pilot, I should say. So, and these have been episode by episode, so episode-specific video discussions leading all the way up to what's commonly referred to as the final episode in season 2, or episode 29 in the common Twin Peaks episodic parlance. So that's where we find ourselves at the point of this video, which is I have discussed everything up to the end of season 2. Before we move on to a discussion of the stories that are to come in the Twin Peaks saga, specifically Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, and then also the episodes that might be found, or including also a discussion of the missing pieces, and also a discussion of each of the episodes of what is referred to as the limited series, or season 3, or the return from a couple years back, or from a few years back, excuse me. Before we move to a discussion of those areas, those brilliant areas of Twin Peaks, and the specific stories and developments that occur within those chapters, as it were. Before we get to that, I'd like to take this moment right now to pause and to think back and reflect on seasons 1 and 2. Again, we've talked about it in a specific episode-by-episode fashion, but now I'd like to take a step back and just reflect in a general manner on what we have seen in seasons 1 and 2. And so for that purpose, this video will be a season 1, season 2 type of general discussion, overview, look back, reflection. And so for that purpose, I will assume that you have seen all the episodes in seasons 1 and 2. This is a very important assumption that I'm making, because I don't, if you haven't seen the entirety of seasons 1 and 2, my strong suggestion is please stop this video right now, and then after you've finished watching everything up to the end of season 2, you can come back to this video discussion again as a general reflection, overview, thoughts and comments that I have on seasons 1 and 2. So that will assume that you have seen everything up to seasons 1 and 2, and I don't want to spoil anything of this great series for anyone who hasn't seen everything up to the end of season 2. So that's one thing. The other thing too is I won't, in that spirit, I won't be, in this video anyway, I won't be talking about anything beyond the end of season 2. So I won't be talking about I won't be talking about any of the stories that we see that have been released subsequent to that initial broadcast of episode 29. So I won't be referring to Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. I won't be referring to anything of the limited series or the return. So don't worry about that. Again, if you haven't seen Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me yet, or if you haven't seen or finished the return or the limited series, don't worry. We're not going to talk talk about that right now. That'll be for another day. But so for now, let us talk about everything that we have seen in a general way in seasons 1 and 2. Okay, with that out of the way and that established, let me now get into the discussion here, which is, so I've tried to suggest or try to convey during these however many videos they have been so far, maybe 30 or so videos, I've tried to convey how much, again, I'm not the biggest expert when it comes to Twin Peaks, and I get many of the details wrong, but I am a great fan. I'm a big admirer of the series and the work overall, and I find it to be so compelling and so interesting and so charming and lovely, and also very scary and tragic and horrific and very unsettling and chilling, and also very funny and very amusing and heartwarming, and with scenes that are almost laugh out loud, hilarious. And so I, even upon rewatch, I have these feelings that reemerge within me as I watch it, while at the same time always being able to discover new things. And there are details that I figure out, or I recognize that maybe I didn't see in a prior watch of the series, seasons 1 and 2. And so this is a mystery puzzle box. There have been many boxes referred to in seasons 1 and 2, of course, as we know. And so this Twin Peaks itself is a type of mystery puzzle box. And much like the puzzle box that held the key, or the puzzle boxes that ultimately led to the key, in terms of what happened to Andrew Packard and at Twin Peaks Savings and Loan, right at the final episode there. But for purposes of the rewatch and the intense joy that one feels when one is engaged with this puzzle box that is Twin Peaks. And I hope maybe the metaphor won't go so far as the explosion set up by Eckert, but rather a further celebration in honor of this great series that is still holding so much of its mystery, so much of its secrets, very much intact, much like, as I say, Laura Palmer herself, how she's described by some of the characters that we've met along the way, like Harold Smith and Dr. Jacoby, as being someone who is so fascinating a character and a person and human being, but at the same time so mysterious and so enigmatic, because she has so many secrets that are unknown and unknowable to many of the people around her, such as Dr. Jacoby, such as Harold Smith, and indeed such as many of the other people that we meet along the way that thought they knew her, or that were telling us that they knew her, but perhaps at the same time, as they too acknowledge, they didn't know her at all, and that she herself is the ultimate type of enigma, the ultimate type of unknown factor when it comes to Twin Peaks. And so we get this from, of course, character discussions from, say, Donna and James, and also Audrey to a certain extent, and also, of course, Sarah Palmer, and even to a certain extent Leland Palmer, as well as other people that knew her, that got to know her. I mentioned, of course, Harold Smith, and there's also Josie and other characters that we understand through the many complex network of characters that have emerged over the course of the investigation by Dale Cooper and Sheriff Truman and others here. We understand that there's a huge network, a lattice-like network of characters and interactions and intrigue, with, it could be said, Laura Palmer at the center of it. And if we think of that, Laura Palmer at the center of these proceedings, and Laura Palmer being the ultimate enigma, she is the ultimate enigma for many reasons, one of which is that she is not, in a certain sense of that phrase, she's not present in terms of being a character that is, quote unquote, actually in the space of the world that we are exploring, Twin Peaks, right? Because at the very start, when we get to the pilot, we understand that she is already died. She has already been killed, which leads to the very legendary and very tragic discovery of the body by Pete Martell. That opens the pilot. So already we understand that. Of course, we have seen Laura Palmer in, say, flashback For instance, when there's a flashback of her talking to James and about the half heart locket. Now my heart belongs to you. Because why are you so happy? Because your skin is so soft and you smell so great. That kind of wonderful James line that we had in a flashback early on in season 1. So we did see images of Laura in flashback. Also, we saw her in the famous videotape, and the videotape, of course, and the reflection in the eye revealing the bike, James's bicycle, or not bicycle, but James's motorcycle. So we saw her in that videotape incarnation. We also see a figure that may or may not be Laura Palmer, may be an image or vision or dream. Again, we have to remember too this distinction between dreams and visions that was so well articulated by Major Briggs as he's talking to Bobby in one of the scenes involving the two of them in the diner, and him recalling the vision about what he saw in terms of the house, the marble, and looking at this person that he understood was his son, and he understood that things would be okay for Bobby in the future. But going back to images or visions or dreams of Laura Palmer, we did see, of course, the very famous dream or vision sequence early on in season 1, did we not, with Dale Cooper and the red curtained room and the man from another place. And in that room, with the very famous and, dare I say it, important decoration on the floor as well. We did see someone who looks like Laura Palmer. Maybe she is Laura Palmer, maybe she's not Laura Palmer, and the like. And so my point here is that we do see images of figures that have the appearance and semblance of Laura Palmer throughout the series. Of course we do. But for all intents and purposes, we can say that the absence of Laura Palmer is the primary function, or not the primary function, but the primary, say, a catalyst for the actual existence that is the series Twin Peaks. After all, the whole crux of the series begins with who killed Laura Palmer. And that, by definition, implies, or it has to suggest, therefore, that Laura Palmer is absent from the equation. She's dead. She has been killed. And because of her absence, the fact that she is absent, and yet in many ways in the context of the series, she is the most important character, that makes her, and I've tried to mention it in previous discussions, her absence/presence in the context of Twin Peaks is really fundamentally important. And I would say, too, that it goes towards what I've tried to describe earlier in how I view the works of David Lynch overall. I mean, this is a work that is a Mark Frost, David Lynch creation, and Mark Frost's contributions are incredibly fundamentally important. Without Mark Frost's contributions, Twin Peaks would not be Twin Peaks. And so it is very important to acknowledge that. It is also very important to acknowledge, too, that another part of that equation, that creative equation, is, of course, the contribution of David Lynch. And one of the aspects of Twin Peaks that makes it so fascinating is the David Lynch quality, for lack of a better phrase, that can be said to be embodied within many of the episodes, perhaps some more intensely than others, that's for sure, maybe especially when we talk about some of the episodes that we see in, say, the mid to latter parts of, say, season 2, for example. That's a conversation I'm willing to have, of course, but as a general proposition, we can say that a lot of the elements of David Lynch's artistic aesthetic are embodied quite organically in the very fiber and very character of Twin Peaks itself. And one of the things, too, that I always find fascinating about the works of David Lynch, including Twin Peaks, is the way in which David Lynch deals with the notion of absence and the notion of non-existence, and how absence and non-existence are handled by Lynch in a way that is paradoxically suggestive of some kind of existential, consciousness. In other words, non-existence equals existence in this paradoxical, almost seemingly contradictory way. But that's the brilliance of David Lynch, because he deals with contradictions in a way that is so fascinating and so attractive, and dealing in a way that can be funny and ludicrous and bizarre. It could also be very horrifying and chilling, and perhaps everything at once at the same time, in a manner of speaking. And so I bring that up because Laura Palmer's absence is perhaps one of the most ingenious types of, say, David Lynch artistic or aesthetic endeavors, because again, it's the ultimate embodiment of what one might call a key aspect of the David Lynch aesthetic, which is the handling of non-existence, the handling of absence in order to generate existence, in order to generate or create a response in the realm of the corporeal, or the quote-unquote real, or the actual. And so this is a very key concept, because it's linked, I think, to many things, not just in the world of David Lynch, but definitely in the context of Twin Peaks. Things that seemingly come from nothing, things that seemingly are of the mundane and ordinary, suddenly adopt this huge ramification, this huge implication. And we call that oftentimes maybe representations, metaphors, or even symbols. And a lot of times we say about Twin Peaks, it's about where is the strength in the symbolism? What something means something else. Something stands in for something else, or something represents something else. And this is very important in interpretation, guidance, and the ways we digest and consume and interact with any form of art, right? Literature, painting, music, and film and television. Twin Peaks is one of the great examples of it, and Lynch is one of the great proprietors and one of the great proponents of this type of thinking, because in his works, there's a lot about things that are seemingly nothing, things that are seemingly maybe absent, but they represent things other than the absence. They represent things that are outside of themselves. They represent things that, in fact, stand in for presence. That's one of the great paradoxes of Twin Peaks. Laura Palmer's absence represents the presence of a lot of the characters, and indeed their interactions with Laura Palmer form a lot of the core components of the character arcs and the character dynamics themselves. Harold Smith is a great example of this. His interactions with Laura Palmer indeed form a really key component about how we engage with Harold Smith as a character. And I would suggest, and so Laura Palmer's absence leads to the presence of Harold Smith, in a manner of speaking. Same thing can be said, I think, for Donna and James. The fact that Laura Palmer is absent means that, in a manner of speaking, Donna and James get together, at least for most of this, a primary part or a majority of the 2 seasons, shall we say. So her absence leads to the presence of their relationship. And it's that presence that leads to further developments of, say, psychological doubt and questioning, right? After all, there's a famous scene early on in season 1 where Donna is being very frank to her mother about how Laura's death caused, maybe was the catalyst for her and James to get together, and that she doesn't feel guilty. She feels very happy about it, but then she's very confused about how she should feel, because again, it's all due to, in a certain manner of thinking, it's all due to the absence or the death of the killing of Laura Palmer. So these sort of psychological implications that are, say, directly related to the absence of a character, the absence of a thing or an idea or concept. Here, the idea or thing or concept or person being Laura Palmer herself, and everything that she represents, everything that she symbolizes, everything that she stands in for in terms of the metaphorical quality. That absence leads to the presence of other things. And so this is very important. Also, too, it can be said to have a direct correlation to the plot, because after all, the absence of Laura Palmer, the death of Laura Palmer, the murder of Laura Palmer leads to the presence or the emergence of other characters, such as the emergence of law enforcement. Dale Cooper arrives on the scene because of the killing of Laura Palmer. So it can be said that Dale Cooper's existence in the context of Twin Peaks, as we engage with him as a viewer, can be said to come about because of the absence of Laura Palmer. So absence leads to presence. And I love this seemingly contradictory quality, because it's very much part of the donut hole. And in Twin Peaks, I understand we get lots of donuts scenes of donuts, and they're really great. And this is, I think, one of the great symbols of Twin Peaks: donuts and coffee. I know there are many different shapes of donuts. There's donuts without the hole. There's a full rounded bread bun with, say, jelly or jam or some kind of cream inside, sweet cream or jelly or jam inside, without the hole. But there's also the iconic look of the donut with the hole in the center. And I understand too that there's a kind of famous quote by David Lynch, which is cataloged in many places you can find online. It's also mentioned in one of the documentaries when we get to, say, the limited series of Return, where David Lynch is understood to have said, "Don't focus on." I'm paraphrasing. Don't focus on the whole. Focus on the donut. And I understand that philosophy very much so, because it's making the assumption that the whole itself is something that is negating something else that is otherwise positive. Then don't focus on the negative space, focus on the positive space, because it's all about creation, it's all about the craft, it's all about the creation of art. And art is, after all, something that is not negative, something that is not zero, something that is not without form, but rather, on the contrary, art is something that is with form. That is, in many ways, the very definition of art, something that has form. And that something that has form leads to some kind of interaction or some kind of reaction on the part of the viewer or the person that is experiencing the art, thus creating some kind of interaction, whether called chemical reaction or emotional reaction between the viewer and the work of art. So therefore, art is, by definition, needs to be positive. Now, that being said, there is I see David Lynch's work as the donut with the hole in the center. And it's all about the hole, because without the hole, the donut, this iconic shape of the donut, seems not to have that same quality of a donut that it would otherwise have, right, with the hole in the center. See, it seems like the donut exists because of the hole, or the donut exists due in part to the hole. In other words, the negativity or the negative space leads to the characterization of the positive space. And so therefore, in that way, the donut is the perfect iconography, in my view, of David Lynch's filmography, and indeed a viewing of Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks is like one big donut to me, with the hole in the center being the absence of Laura Palmer. But it's the absence of Laura Palmer that creates the definition of the bread dough, the sweet bread around it, the cooked bread around it, that is the donut sustenance itself. So sustenance or presence is formed, or it's given shape because of the absence. And so I find that image to be very strong for me. So indeed, in fact, for me, the donut consideration is about the form itself, but it's also about the whole. And this is a very key concept for me. And in fact, I feel that way about all of David Lynch's works, his feature film works. All of his works are donuts. They are donuts, and it is therefore a key image and symbol for me of that being the donut. And indeed, too, to take it a slightly different direction, it also goes to the notion of things in Twin Peaks, and indeed things in the world of Lynch films, where things that seemingly are so mundane and ordinary, in fact, have such an import and meaning and significance given the circumstances. So, for example, the donut, it seems to have a very maybe mundane, almost ordinary thing. It's every day. It's something that people eat in the diner before they are off and going about their duties in terms of work, right? They're going to eat donuts prior to the investigation, prior to the explanation of the Tibetan analytical method by Dale Cooper out in the woods, before he throws the rocks, right? Or the stones, right? And so this is, the donuts are very important. Also, donuts are on the table that start the day or end the day or are part of the day. Donuts are eaten during the investigation of the living space of Jacques Renault, for example. So, and other places, other things of this sort. So donuts are the thing that start the day. In other words, they are so mundane and ordinary in that way, but they are also extraordinary and filled with a lot of deep meaning for the way that I was trying to suggest earlier, and also because they are the type of sustenance and lead to various aspects. I mean, after all, it is the drip of the blood And where does the blood land? It lands on the donuts that are on the table when Waldo is shot, right? Waldo is assassinated. And so this is an example, I think, where the donut can be said to be something that is mundane, but even mundane, ordinary things can have such an extraordinary significance. I mean, another example too found later on when Annie and Dale Cooper are in the diner, and then there's a sudden crash of dishes or plates, and we see the close-up, the extreme close-up of what looks like the drip of, say, some kind of sauce or molasses or something, syrup or something like that. And it's syrup or sauce that is on a plate in a diner seems very ordinary, very mundane, but it's the close-up on this that ends that particular segment, that leads, I think, into a commercial break, if I recall correctly. But it's that close-up into that with the sound that's really echoing throughout the entire piece that leads us to believe that indeed something as mundane and ordinary as sauce or syrup dripping from a broken plate or crashed or a plate that's fallen on the ground or whatever can have a lot of meaning and indeed an ominous effect. And indeed, too, we are reminded this because what follows after this in an episode or two later, but the dramatic and chaos, the chaotic shock that is the Miss Twin Peaks debacle. Thanks to the devilish and nefarious efforts of the one and only Wyndham Earle. There are other similar shots like this. Remember when Leland Palmer is being interrogated at the sheriff's department, and the episode opens with a huge, intense close-up that leads into the holes that we see in the paneling on the side there. And so we understand that this kind of intense look is this thing where something so mundane and ordinary, like paneling in a wall or ceiling, a little hole that is part of the decoration, can have such a deep and meaningful and indeed quite ominous and heavy impact going forward. And so this is very much part of the notion that's at play in Twin Peaks and also David Lynch's works. Things that are ordinary, quote unquote, ordinary or normal stand in for things that are, quote unquote, extraordinary and abnormal or irregular. Another thing too, this is very much part of the case, and what that means is, of course, up to you as in terms of the subjective experience of you, the viewer, right? Because we can say, for instance, what does the white horse mean? White horse that is suddenly emerging in the vision of Sarah Palmer, just prior to, for example, the killing of Maddie during that very important episode in season 2. So what does this white horse mean? Does it mean something of life? Does it mean something of death? And I think either interpretation is quite possible. I think some interpretations, some theories, of course, are perhaps have a longer lasting quality, say, within the fan base and within the group of admirers and fans and theorists and experts of Twin Peaks all across the world throughout the years. I understand this, but my point, for instance, with that example is that something can really stand for something else in terms of symbolism and interpretation of imagery. But I think also what's so great about Twin Peaks is that the ripeness of it and the malleability of it means that even something that stands for something, that even something that even something that might stand for one thing could, in the eyes of a viewer, another viewer might stand for something completely different. And so what does that mean? Or what does this mean? Or what does that particular aspect, what is the significance of, say, the owl? What is the significance of the ring? Is it a malevolent image, or is it a benevolent image? What is the significance of, say, a character like, say, the man from another place? Is this character a benevolent character, or is it a malevolent character? It's the same thing with something like the giant, or the giant, or the waiter. Are these malevolent characters, or these benevolent characters? Are these allies, or are these friends, or are these foes? And so I think it really depends on our viewing and our viewership and our subjective experience. And again, I think depending on who we are, we can come to different conclusions about the same iconography that exists within Twin Peaks. And so that's not to say that I am not... I don't see any value in engaging in the interpretation of symbolism of Twin Peaks. On the contrary, it is incredibly important. is incredibly important. And it's also incredibly important too because, again, we have to realize that much like, or to just finish this idea of ordinary or seemingly ordinary mundane things standing for things that are quite extraordinary or abnormal or perhaps even ominous and horrific or tragic. Things that are symbolic, right? They tend to be symbolic either because the things that they are standing in for have a quality or look or feel or aesthetic that is similar in tone and look to the thing itself. In other words, if this thing here is representing this thing here, sometimes the two things will look similar. But what's so amazing about, say, Twin Peaks in the world of David Lynch, for example, is that, in fact, I would say that for most of the symbolism that exists, if not for all the symbolism that exists here, in fact, there is such a divide. There is such a, say, a distance between, say, how the thing looks versus, or how the thing that is there looks and feels and acts in the space of the world versus what it's meant to represent, or what it represents depending on what theory is being espoused by the viewer that has experienced that scene at the time. So, for example, the white horse. Could it be said to be representing something that's quite malevolent and quite evil? If that's the case, then one can say that that malevolence or evil is actually quite different from the beauty and majesty that we see of this white horse that's under this bright light. It's a very beautiful image, but it's one that could stand in for something that's very sinister. Similar thing with owls. If one espouses the theory that owls somehow are standing in for some kind of evil force, the owls are not what they seem. One can say too that owls, right, there is a certain look about them, there is a certain mystery about them, that's for sure, but there's also a beauty and majesty and grace about them in terms of how they move, how they fly, the way that their necks are the sort of physiology or the mechanics of the skeletal structure of owls. It's quite a beautiful thing. But its beauty is one thing, but what it represents is something quite evil and quite malicious, possibly anyway, depending on one's theory or viewpoint. That's another example. And so, I mean, there are many examples of this that exist throughout Twin Peaks as well. Things that stand in for one thing that are quite, in fact, quite different. And so, for instance, what is the significance of something like, say, the young boy and Mrs. Tremont and right, I am a lonely soul and cream corn. What does this mean? Is it standing in for something else that is actually quite different than what cream corn implies? I mean, cream corn implies something that is maybe has a certain flavor, corn flavor, maybe something sweet due to the cream. I'm not sure, but again, it might imply something very, very drastically and radically different, thus leading to the extreme examples of what the interpretations might lead to in terms of, say, for example, what cream corn means. And so I think that extremity also leads to a wide possibility, a wide range of interpretations, which is, I think, one of the great things and beauties of Twin Peaks, and one of the great things of David Lynch's works overall, is that this wide range, this extremity, is one of the most brilliant aspects, and it makes for compelling watch because for many reasons. One of which being, it means that we can have differing views on the same subject matter, and indeed maybe we within our own selves, depending on the rewatch, we can have differing views within our own minds at the same time. Alternate views about what this means or what that means. So that's one of the great things about Twin Peaks. That's one of the great things about Lynch works overall, what it stands in for. And two, just to borrow that idea of things standing in for something else, what does that signify too, if anything, right? This is another way to say the word secret, right? The word secret itself, or the meaning of secret, is something that is hidden, something that is maybe not visible on the surface, right? And so something that is not visible on the surface, this is another way to describe symbolism. Something that's on the surface might be signifying something that is not on the surface, right? In other words, the secret of a symbol. The secret of a symbol is, or the viewpoint or the expression of that secret of the symbol, I think, is very significant. And very important for me as a viewer of Twin Peaks, because it also means too that it links to the idea of secrets. Twin Peaks is about secrets. It is about things that are hidden. It is about the discovery of things that are hidden. And sometimes, too, it leads like a puzzle box that's set up by Eckert for the final confrontation against the Martell, Catherine and Pete and Andrew Packard there. Much like that puzzle box, secrets then lead to other secrets, then lead to other secrets, then lead to other secrets. And so it's not to say that it's just one level, but there could be many levels occurring within the same human being, within the same source, within the same secret. Case in point, Leland Palmer. Leland Palmer is himself one of the ultimate secrets of this work, Twin Peaks, and we discover throughout the course of many of the episodes that indeed his surface level of, say, someone who is, works in the law, lawyer, works for Ben Horne, is a family man, married to Sarah Palmer, the father of Laura Palmer, etc. So he seems to be in a good standing in the community, etc. We understand that is just surface level, because as we get to know Leland Palmer, we understand there's a lot there that is in fact quite different from the surface image that we understood Leland Palmer to be when we first meet him. And so this is another example of things standing in for something else, and the extreme expanse between the surface versus what lies underneath. I mean, after all, there's nothing, I think, more extreme than, say, the image of the family man Leland Palmer versus what he has actually done, which is murder his daughter, and indeed also the other implications about what might have happened a year or so ago as well. But in any event, it's sexual assault and incest. It's very, very disturbing, and so this disturbing and horrific implication of what we understand happened to Laura Palmer when she died and when she was killed very brutally is indeed a far, far cry from that image of the person in good standing in the community, Leland Palmer. And so this is, again, another example of things standing in for something else that are, in many senses of that understanding, very, very 180-degree different from what is lurking underneath. And that's the case for secrets, right? Secrets sometimes can be things that are so radically different from what we understand on the surface level to exist. And so these secrets are the backbone of Twin Peaks. Leland Palmer's secret is one. In fact, his secret is almost like that Thomas Eckert puzzle box, because it leads to further secrets within. Not just what he's done, but what is the responsibility? What are the implications of Bob, the inhabiting soul or spirit? What is the interaction between Bob's soul and, say, Leland Palmer's soul? Who is Bob? What is Bob doing? What is his purpose? What is his philosophy, etc.? So these lead to more secrets that are, when the layers are peeled, indeed, when more layers are peeled, the more we understand that we don't understand anything at all. And so we think we know what we know, but when we know, we understand we don't know at all. And so that is the idea of secrets leading to secrets, leading to secrets, leading to secrets. And indeed, along the way, sometimes those jumps are so extreme in nature, going back to the idea of things that are being symbolized are in fact radically different from that which is the image itself. So things that are actually lurking within the surface, the key to the secrets, are indeed so radically different from the surface image itself. And so that is one of the great mysteries of Twin Peaks, indeed. And that is what guides us throughout the film, throughout the work, throughout the series. And indeed, this type of philosophy indeed shows us that no one is beyond suspicion, in a manner of speaking. For example, who is Josie? Who is, who is Sheriff Truman, especially when Sheriff Truman is thinking about Josie? Who is Dale Cooper? What is the significance of Pittsburgh and what happened with Caroline and Wyndham Earle, etc., and him being, his quote-unquote tragic failing? Who is Ben Horne? Who is Jerry Horne? Who is Catherine Martell? Right? Who's Tojamura? Right? Tojamura, exactly. So these sorts of things lead. There's some secrets that might be more easily conceivable than others. There might be some secrets that might be more easily guessable than others. I totally get that. But the point I want to bring up here is that secrets themselves, or the concept of secrets, is a key component. It's going back to our understanding of Laura Palmer, right? I mean, the man with another place said it himself. She's filled with secrets, or at least referring to that which looks like Laura Palmer. We're not sure if it really is Laura Palmer, but But the point here is that Laura Palmer herself, or the idea or image of Laura Palmer, was one that was also filled with secrets. And so the idea of unlocking those secrets becomes the path or the quest. And it's that quest that Dale Cooper is on, that's that quest that Sheriff Truman is on, that's the quest that other people like Hawk and Andy and by extension other people like Lucy and others, that the quest that they are on to search for the heart of the secret. And indeed, another way to say that is to search for the truth. And if Twin Peaks is anything, it is a story about searches and journeys towards what one might call endeavors towards truth, or what is the ultimate outcome. And sometimes truth is in quotation marks, because it's sometimes not the quote-unquote absolute truth, but maybe it's a subjective truth. Case in point, I spoke about Lucy, her journey. Her journeys, of course, or one of her journeys in Twin Peaks is to essentially choose between Andy and Dick Tremaine as to the who is the father of her unborn child. But in fact, she makes the choice of Andy at the very end of season 2, does she not? Right, and she makes the choice conscious of the possibility that perhaps the baby, that her unborn child is not in fact right. Andy's probably, it might not be the biological father of that child, but she makes the conscious choice, and her journey comes to an end, in a manner of speaking, because her conclusion is that quote unquote truth, or the end of the journey for her, is Andy will be the father of her child, which is another way to say to that she has chosen Andy, and Andy indeed reciprocates. And so they will be together. At least that's what we understand. And indeed, the opening of episode 29, if anything, does show a fulfillment of that type of, say, for lack of a better phrase, prophecy, that indeed Andy and Lucy will be together. And so Lucy, perhaps maybe in contravention of the absolute truth of who in fact the biological father of her child is, still has come to the end of her journey with, for what might be called, a subjective truth, or truth on her terms. And I think that is also another way to say that it's her journey is an example of a search for truth, the unlocking of secrets. And we get this too with many people. Audrey and her journey in the first season, in terms of the search for the truth, going to One-Eyed Jack's, and then also a type of search for truth or an understanding with regard to Ben Horne and her relationship with her father, etc., especially as it develops in season 2, and his, say, path towards, say, the Civil War era aspect of his character, let's put it that way. Donna and James, of course, are on a mission or a journey of truth, trying to find out who killed Laura Palmer on their own terms. And James, of course, is on a type of mission or journey as well when he leaves Twin Peaks. And that goes into this idea of Evelyn and that backstory, etc. That's also, in many ways, a type of journey towards truth. Like, what is Evelyn's plan? What's going on with her husband? And what's going on with this person? It ends up unraveling and revealing that, in fact, it's a whole plot to try to implicate James in this crime, and essentially to kill Evelyn's husband and to get the money, right? So, and that's also in many ways a sort of journey for truth on the part of James, but it's also done on his terms, because he is trying to thwart but also trying to save his own life. And of course, Donna interjects at just the opportune moment, as we know, in that latter part of season 2 there. So these are, I think, examples of the idea of truth. But I also shy away from the idea of absolute truth. I also say subjective truth, because sometimes we see characters that are arriving at what they think is true, but in fact, it could be said from a different vantage point to be completely off base from a quote-unquote reality of the situation. Another case in point, Nadine, her story, right? Her story, she's trying to, I mean, after what happened in her attempted suicide, that ends season 1 and that opens season 2, we understand that she is risen from her comatose state to then think that she is 18 years old again, or she's a high school student again. So in her mind, her truth is that she is a high school student, at least throughout most of season 2. But in fact, we understand that the truth, at least from the perspective, say, Norma and Ed, is in fact far from. However, what does Ed, Norma, and Dr. Jacoby, etc., try to do? So Doc Hayward's advice is, what do they try to do? But they try not just to thwart Nadine from this idea that she is a high school student, but in fact support it. And in fact, it is that quote-unquote subjective truth of Nadine that almost forms the key that will bring Norma and Ed together, right? Because at the very end, or near the very end, what is the key to them getting together is the fact that Nadine thinks that she's a high school student and she's infatuated with Mike, right, and the buns of Mike, as well as many other things, I'm sure. But the idea here is that the subjective truth of Nadine, however far off, quote unquote, reality it might seem, it is being supported by everyone around her because each person has his or her own motive. In fact, it is in everyone's best interest that Nadine's "quote unquote" truth remain as undisturbed as possible, right? And in fact, we understand that this is one of the ways in which Ed and Norma think that they will be able to get together. And what happens to that? That truth is shattered because that truth leads to another truth. The truth at the very end of the season, which is Nadine comes out of it, and she is back to where she is in season 1, and the Drape Runners, etc. And so this is the return to truth, but it shatters the truths of many of the other characters, as well as the truth of Mike, as well as what happens with Nadine, with Norma and Ed. So this type of I think balancing act, this paradoxical balancing act, is another wonderful, enigmatic, almost puzzle box of Twin Peaks, and exists in even these corners of, say, subplot that might seem quote-unquote superfluous or maybe not directly relevant to, say, the main plot line of Twin Peaks and the investigation, and Mike and Bob and the Black Lodge and Dale Cooper's efforts, etc. But they are, in fact, very much thematically and indeed spiritually a part of Twin Peaks in a very organic and important way for these and other reasons. So the reasons I'm trying to suggest here, as well as other reasons. So it is an incredibly a powerful reminder of the idea of truth and subjectivity. And sometimes it's not always what it appears to be, but in fact, the lie or the illusion or the fragmentary vision or the fragmentary quote unquote reality is sometimes supported almost to a fault by the characters in Twin Peaks, because it not just it furthers, say, the aesthetic of David Lynch in terms of symbols, things standing in for something else, right? Nadine's existence standing in for something completely different from what she appears in reality, right? Her appearance is not like what she thinks she is inside, right? From a manner of speaking. So, and not only does that type of subplot serve, say, the aesthetic of symbolism and absence presence in the world of, say, David Lynch and Mark Frost, but also it serves the plot, and it serves psychological indications or revelations of psychological reasonings of the characters, because after all, Ed and Norma, they support this, right? And why would they support this? They support this because they get together, a kind of reunion in a manner of speaking. They acknowledge their love for each other. They don't want to be. They want to share their lives with each other. And so, what does that mean? That means that they need to prop up and support Nadine's essentially fantasy. And so this is an indication of the thinking of Ed, the thinking of Norma, and their psychological, say, and wants and needs and desires as characters. And so indeed, this type of subjective truth interplay is not just a furtherance of, say, what the Lynchian aesthetic, but it's a furtherance of the development of the minds and hearts and spirits and characteristics of the characters in question. And so we get a further understanding of who these characters are and who they seem to be. And that's very important too in the world of Twin Peaks, because as I was mentioning earlier, characters are not always what they seem to be upon first glance or first meeting. I think a wonderful example of how Twin Peaks operates in this full, robust way, so organic. Each of the pieces, again, maybe to some people, the Nadine storyline might seem like a minor storyline, or a storyline that's not necessarily a significantly major one. And if you feel that way, I totally understand that. It's not my purpose here to try to persuade you otherwise. But what I'm trying to suggest is, for me, it does have that sense of organic unity, and it's a wonderful. That's an example of how wonderful I believe Twin Peaks as a work is, and the strength of that organic unity. And indeed, too, opposites. This idea of symbols and extremities in symbols and secrets also leads to the idea of opposites. And when we think of opposites, oftentimes the things that come up in terms of things that aren't what they seem. example, Albert. When we first meet Albert as a character, he is very acerbic, very off-putting. And in fact, when we get to know him, arguably, we understand that he is actually quite different from that kind of acerbic, rough quality that might have been suggested upon initial meetings with Albert. Right, that leads to the very famous speech about his espousing of the philosophies of Gandhi and King, right? And his declaration, "I love you, Sheriff Truman," which seems to a far cry from the type of almost aggressively negative spirit that he seemed to be exhibiting when he first enters the world of Twin Peaks. So that idea of extremity is very important. And things are not what they seem, right? The owls are not what they seem. Things are not what they seem. And so this leads to the extremity in symbolism, etc. But also opposites, right? And what we see in terms of opposites, things standing in for things that are completely opposite to what they are signifying to us in terms of the minds of the viewers as we experience the images. So that's that aspect of the opposite. But also the opposite leads to the notion of the double. Two, dualism and doppelgangers. And of course, another thing about Twin Peaks, I mean, it's in the name Twin Peaks, twins too, right? So the idea here that is, I think, expressed in a nuanced, indirect way, and oftentimes too, in a direct, plot relevant way, which is the idea of the double and the duality. And I mean the double and duality in terms of external forms, people who look like other people. One of the important examples of this is, of course, Maddie and Laura. They're, of course, played by the same actor, right, Cheryl Lee, and that further drives home the fact that they look very similar in terms of characters. They are very different, but they're also very similar. And in that, indeed, this similarity, this doppelganger-like quality, comes up in a number of significant and indeed quite challenging ways. Of course, this is comes up in the plot, in the context of the plot, when Donna and James and Maddie try to lure Dr. Jacoby out, right, into the gazebo area, and that leads to, right, them pretending that Laura is still alive, and so essentially tricking Dr. Jacoby. So that's part of the plot. And also, it's part of Madeline's character too. How she's trying, she admits to James just before she leaves, right, about how she, and also a little bit earlier in some of the other scenes about how they used to pretend to be. You know, it was like when Laura died, it was like she felt like she could become Laura. And indeed, maybe that was part of the reason why she and James felt that mutual attraction that they seem to have in some parts of the episodes, right? So that is a very important aspect of the plot and also character development in the context of the Laura-Maddie dynamic. But also, it serves a very frightening function because we understand that this is something that reminds Leland or Bob of Laura, the appearance of Maddie, especially when Maddie decides to leave, go back to Missoula, Montana. And also the idea of doppelgangers at the very end, when we go back to in episode 29, how episode 29 ends, right? And what we understand is the Black Lodge. And so this is the idea of doppelgangers and the threat that arises in terms of the double. And this threat is also quite real, especially when we understand what happens to Dale Cooper at the end of season 2. And we shall see too, maybe how the idea of the double and how the idea of the concept of the double, how that is a really important one because it's, I think, at the same time showing us the external threat and then also the internal threat as well. And this idea of the external and the internal is one of the most important aspects in terms of how I interact with Twin Peaks. So take another example, which is how the idea of doppelgangers or doubles are expressed in how Dale Cooper as a character ends up by the end of, say, episode 29, right? Because you understand, or the implication is that Bob has now taken over the body of Dale Cooper, which is now back in the quote-unquote real world, and say maybe there are two Coopers, and there's maybe there is a good Dale and a bad Dale. And so maybe the implication is that there is a bad Dale Cooper that is now out and about in the world. How's Annie? How's Annie? I need to brush my teeth, etc. And the idea that Bob is now occupying this body, this corporeal form that looks like Dale Cooper, but in fact perhaps is not. So we can understand maybe Bob, therefore, is seemingly pushing on or propelling forward this notion of the externality of the double. And the externality of the double, in other words, what Dale Cooper's double is something or someone other than himself, thus leading to the idea of two Coopers. And if that holds, we might see some kind of development of this maybe in future discussions and stories of Twin Peaks. Who knows? But that seems to be how episode 29 ends. That seems to be how season 2 ends. That right, this very important chapter of Twin Peaks seems to be ending on this very important and quite intense cliffhanger. One of the most intense cliffhangers of all of Twin Peaks, I would argue. But it also shows in that way the externality of the doppelganger, and therefore one's double is something that's outside of oneself. And if one's double is outside of oneself, that means that the threat of the double is an external threat. And if the threat is external, that means the menace and the nefarious nature, the threat, the danger, is something that is outside of oneself. Now, if we understand this, then the idea of the double, or the dissection of the concept of the double, is very important in the overall, dealing with, the philosophy of Twin Peaks. And indeed, and going back to the whole notion of symbols and symbolisms and metaphors and what it all means, right? Because another way to look at Twin Peaks is how we view the threat, how we view the menace, how we view the evil that we are undoubtedly dealing with. So we're undoubtedly dealing with a story that is about evil. We're undoubtedly dealing with a story that is about violence and destruction and chaos. Now, the question is, what is the source of that violence and chaos and evil? Where does it come from? Does it come from a place outside of ourselves? In other words, does it come from an external source? Or does it come from a place that is inside us? Does it come from something within us? In other words, is it part of us? Now, this is a really important question. One that I think Twin Peaks, it gives us guidance as to how we might answer that as viewers, as we interpret this great series, as we watch it. But I think the point is that it gives us both options as possibilities. And I think we see this as an example in terms of the Dale Cooper character. Dale Cooper's doppelganger, if we can call him that, I think can stand for the theory that indeed the evil is coming from an external force or external threat, namely something that is a double that is outside Dale Cooper's good self himself. Or, if we remember Dale Cooper's mentionings of his past, Pittsburgh, what happened to Caroline, was it his fault or not? We're not quite sure, right? Why does Wyndham Earle have this antagonistic relationship with Dale Cooper? Was it because Wyndham Earle was like that from the very get-go, in other words, the external threat? Or was it something within Dale Cooper himself, a failure or weakness of his character, or maybe something that is sinister or unknown, or perhaps even evil as a character? Who knows? It's not quite clear. But the point is, I think the possibility for at least a discussion of that is there. Namely, what is the source of the menace or threat when it comes to the character of Dale Cooper? Is it external, or maybe is it internal? Or maybe it's a little bit of both. Who knows? We might get our answers, or we might get some kind of further discussion, maybe in future Twin Peaks stories. Who knows? But that is one example of, is it external or is it internal? I think another example, and which is perhaps part of the key component of the mystery of Twin Peaks itself, who killed Laura Palmer? We know that the killer, the culprit, is Leland Palmer. And we know this because we get a confession. We also get a sense of the finality of that confession when we get it in season 2. We also see what Leland Palmer does to Maddie. Also in season 2. And so we understand that Leland Palmer is the killer. Now, the question in terms of external threat versus internal threat, where is the source of the evil? Where is the source of the violence? Is it external or is it internal? Now, this is a really important question, and it's important in terms of how one views the character of Leland Palmer. And it's even mentioned in Twin Peaks itself, which is was it Leland that was responsible for the killing, or was it Bob that was responsible for the killing? If the answer to that question for you is Bob, that means the threat or the evil is external to Leland. It's outside of Leland. In other words, Leland himself wasn't responsible for the killing of Laura Palmer. It was beyond his control. Now, that's one, I think, very viable and very reasonable interpretation to make. But another reasonable and viable interpretation to make is, in fact, no. It was Leland who did it all along. It was Leland and his, whatever feelings that he had. That was the responsibility that caused him to do what he did to his daughter, indeed to other victims that we understand may also exist. So Leland, the evil of what Leland has done came from Leland himself. Now, this is actually posed as a question in one of the episodes after the discovery of Leland as the killer, right? And the idea when the law officers meet in the woods. And Major Briggs is there as well, and there's the question that is raised here, which is the notion of this idea of the unknown, the spirits, and Sheriff Truman wondering, what there's so much unknown, and indeed Major Briggs also brings up Shakespeare and Hamlet. There's more to heaven and earth than is dreamt up in our philosophy, and so this idea too that maybe it's, and also. Albert at that point also mentioned that maybe that's what Bob is, the evil that men do. I think that's his line. And so the idea is that if Bob is responsible for what Leland has done, then that means Bob is an external threat, an external force, and Bob is evil, but the evil is outside of ourselves. But what Cooper says here in the scene is very, very, very curious, and thus incredibly, I think, important. Which is, and I'm paraphrasing. Does it make you any more right? Is one explanation more comfortable than the other? In other words, is it more comfortable to think that it was Bob that did it, or is it more comfortable to think that Leland Palmer raped and killed his own daughter? And I think that, again, I'm my poor paraphrasing, and I apologize, but the point that I wanted to bring up is that this is the heart of the question that I'm asking here, which is the evil, the source of the evil, external or internal? And I think depending on the answer to that question, the implications are incredibly intense indeed. If you go one way, then that leads to the whole theory of who Bob is, who Mike is. What is the idea of the owls? What is their presence? The red room, or the black lodge, the white lodge, the man from another place, the giant. What are their roles? Right? It's all outside of ourselves, so it's all external. These are all mysteries that again are not part of, say, the internal psychological framework and landscape of the character, but something outside of them. Or are they standing in for that which is inside of us, the evil or the menace or the negativity that can be within us? And so if that's the case, are they the ultimate metaphors for the evil that men do? Again, to borrow the phrase from Albert. And maybe that's what Bob is. And if that's the case, if that's really what Bob is, and if that's what these other symbols and figures and mysteries are, then what are we looking at in terms of a discussion of Twin Peaks and a consideration of Twin Peaks, but rather the idea of the complexities of the human condition, the complexity of who we are as people underneath, even when the surface might be suggesting something completely different from what actually lies underneath. The idea here is that the evil and the complexity and the moral ambiguity is all from within us, or as human beings, is all from the human experience, and thus we are responsible. The human being that is carrying out the act is responsible for that act. And if that's the case, there are, I think, major ramifications in terms of viewing of humanity and a type of philosophy towards a sort of a human condition, existentialism. Indeed, and we see these characters in a whole new light. Leland Palmer for sure, Dale Cooper for sure, and maybe other characters as well that seemingly need to have agency in terms of their own lives and their own responsibilities and their own actions. Or indeed, is there something of the supernatural, something of the religious, something that extends maybe outside of ourselves? It doesn't mean that it's totally beyond ourselves. There are still connections like that, but maybe there are other things as well that indeed are inexplicable, that are unknown, that are things that we cannot control. Indeed, that is also part of the human experience. We live in a world that is not just ourselves, but we live in a world that is other people, other things, other experiences that are indeed beyond our control. And sometimes that can be expressed in, say, forms of, say, storytelling. Sometimes that can be expressed in say, a symbolism and significance in terms of, and that is adopted in our way of living our daily lives. And indeed, that leads, I think, to a great discussion of how, say, a religious symbolism and various viewpoints of philosophy in terms of how we not just internalize things, but how we relate to the outside world and things that are beyond us. I think that also leads into Twin Peaks and how it relates to religion and theology and various points of view in terms of a type of a philosophy, a type of existential viewpoint in terms of the human condition. So I think there are incredible ramifications so many ramifications that are beyond my own individual comprehension, because my intelligence level is very, very limited. In fact, very, very shallow indeed. So I'm totally ill-equipped when it comes to these concepts. But suffice to say, they are certainly there, and there have been many people much more intelligent, much smarter than I, who've been able to unpack these with a great deal of detail and care than I could ever hope to achieve. So that is, I guess, my way to say, let me end my conversation here in terms of seasons 1 and 2 and say that it is a bold statement indeed, this Twin Peaks is. And let me just say too, going back to something that I was saying about coffee, or the images that seem so ordinary and mundane, but in fact have so much significance and meaning, I would suggest coffee. I mentioned donuts earlier, but coffee is another one. Coffee is something that appears all over Twin Peaks. The great coffee, a little gift to yourself that Cooper says to Truman one day in the diner. It's like buying yourself a shirt or something. You should give yourself a little present every day, like 2 steaming hot cups of coffee that are just right there waiting for them. And so it's this idea of joy, this joy that that is brought about. And something that is every day. Everyone knows what coffee is, right? So that experience of drinking coffee and the joy that people have, Dale Cooper has, especially also, and the highs and lows as well, especially if you have a fish in the percolator, the kind of low that one can feel, the disappointment, the grave disappointment one can feel if one has a quote-unquote bad cup of coffee, versus the heights and joys that one can feel, and the happiness that one can feel when one has quote-unquote a good cup of coffee. So in many ways, coffee is the ultimate symbol. Because coffee is so ordinary, so mundane, but yet it's the expression of the whole gamut of the human condition. Great heights of happiness versus the great depths of sadness. And indeed, too, is it not curious that one of the final lasting images that lingers on in the final episode of season 2, episode 29, as it's often referred to, is the idea of the cup of coffee. And what happens to the cup of coffee when Cooper is in the Black Lodge, right? He has the cup of coffee, which is given to him by the waiter. Coffee, right? And then what happens to the cup of coffee? It becomes liquid at one moment. It becomes solid the next. It becomes this thick, viscous goo another moment. It's almost as though it's the ultimate kind of Jean-Paul Sartre type of image there. It's the ultimate form of torture, existential torture in a manner of speaking. You want to enjoy the cup of coffee, but you can't because it's a solid state, or it's viscous, or it's goo, or it's some kind of slime. Something that brings so much joy can bring so much pain and torture at the same time. This, I think, is one of the great symbols, therefore, of coffee, of Twin Peaks, this idea of coffee. And indeed, what ends the episode 29 over the closing credits, but the cup of coffee and the reflection, whose reflection of it is in that cup of coffee. It looks like perhaps a figure that looks like Laura Palmer. Is it Laura Palmer? We're not sure, but in many ways, therefore, coffee is one of the ultimate symbols, one of the ultimate sources of joy, one of the ultimate sources of pain and tragedy. And we shall see maybe how coffee can continue on, maybe in the world of Twin Peaks and beyond, as we get to subsequent episodes, subsequent stories in this great world. But in that way, my dear friends, let me now close this long-winded conversation. I'm very sorry for the length of this. I do apologize. It wasn't my intention. But that's just, again, Twin Peaks gets me worked up. And while I might not get all the details down right, while I might not be the biggest expert, and I am not the biggest expert at all, not even close. I am a beginner. Twin Peaks 101. If there was a class called Twin Peaks 101, I'd still get a failing grade because I don't have all the facts under my belt. But I have seen it many a time, and I will continue to do so. And indeed, in that spirit, I would like to say that I'm a big fan and admirer of Twin Peaks, and my fandom and admiration of Twin Peaks exists not just for seasons 1 and 2, but also exists for what we will talk about next, which is Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. So my dear friends, my dear friends, won't you join me in future discussions talking about, next up, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. Until then, my friends, thank you and cheers.